The stamping press on line 2 had a rhythm I could hear through 2 closed doors and a length of hallway, a heavy metallic thud every 2.5 seconds that I had learned, over 34 years, to feel almost as much as here, the way you feel your own pulse without thinking about it. It was running clean that morning. I remember noticing that, walking toward the front office at 7:15 with a maintenance report in a manila folder under one arm. Line 2 was running clean. No hitch in the rhythm. Nothing wrong with the machines at all. It was only the people inside the building that morning who were about to prove that not everything running smoothly on the outside is actually fine underneath. The paper cup in my hand had gone cold 20 minutes before he said it, and I remember that detail more clearly than almost anything else from that morning. The coffee going cold while I stood in the doorway of a conference room I had walked into 1,000 times before as a man who mattered. Bradley Cole didn't look up from his tablet when he said it. He didn't even set the tablet down. "You're fired, Daniel. Effective now." 4 words. Maybe 5, if you count the name. 34 years. And he said it the way a man tells a waiter he ordered the wrong side dish. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask why. Not right then. Though the why would come later, and it would be worse than anything I imagined standing in that doorway. I set the cold coffee down on the edge of the conference table, careful not to let it ring against the wood, and I said, "All right." Just that. All right. And I walked out of Whitfield Cole Precision Fasteners, through the same loading dock door I had walked through as a 26-year-old machinist with grease under his fingernails and a wife waiting at home who believed in me more than I believed in myself. I had absolutely no idea, standing in that parking lot with a cardboard box of 34 years balanced on one hip, that in 14 months I would be the one signing the papers that decided whether Bradley Cole kept his house in Oakwood or lost it to the bank. Neither did he. Nobody in that building had the first idea what was about to happen, and that includes me, because on that particular Tuesday morning I was not thinking about revenge. I was thinking about how I was going to tell my wife that the only job I had ever really had was gone, and that I did not have the first idea who I was going to be without it. My name is Daniel Whitfield, and this is not, despite the last name on that building, a story about family. It is a story about what a man builds with his hands over 34 years, and what happens when the people who inherit what you build beside you are a line item instead of a legacy. It is a story about the quiet difference between anger and patience, and how one of those things gets you nothing, and the other one, if you are willing to wait long enough and work hard enough, can get you everything. I lived, at the time all this happened, on 6 acres outside Springboro, Ohio, about 35 minutes south of Dayton, close enough to the plant that I could be there in 18 minutes if a line went down at 2 in the morning, and far enough that when I came home the crickets and the pond frogs were the only reminders that a world existed beyond the fence line of a factory floor. I am 61 years old. I was a machinist before I was anything else, and some part of me will always measure other men by whether they know the difference between a good weld and a lazy one. I started at what was then just Cole Fasteners in 1991, on the second shift, running a stamping press for $6.40 an hour, because the man who owned the place, Walter Cole, Bradley's father, had looked at my hands during the interview instead of my resume and said, "These hands have worked before. I like that better than a diploma." Walter Cole built that company out of a single rented bay behind a tire shop on Route 4, and by the time I came along he had 11 employees and a dream that outran his cash flow by about 2 years, every year for a decade. I don't need to tell you I worked hard. Every man in this kind of story worked hard. That's not the interesting part. What's interesting is what the work cost me and what it gave me, because those two things were the same thing, which is something you don't understand until you're old enough to look back at your whole life laid out behind you like a field you plowed one row at a time. My hands are not soft. There is a permanent groove worn into the pad of my right thumb from 40 years of loading die sets, a scar across my left palm from 1997 that still goes white in cold weather, and knuckles that ache before rain the way old men's knuckles are supposed to, but that started aching for me at 44 instead of 60. I built the second production line at that plant with my own 2 hands in 1998, when Walter couldn't afford to hire an outside contractor, and I told him I'd figured out how to lay the conveyor myself if he trusted me with a weekend and a rented forklift. I have never forgotten the sound that line made the first time we ran it clean. No jams, no scrap. Just steel moving the way steel is supposed to move when a man has done his job right. That sound is still, all these years later, one of the best sounds I have ever heard. Right up there with my daughter's first laugh and the particular hush of a house at midnight when everyone you love is finally asleep and safe. The plant itself sat on 4 acres just off Route 4, a low-tin brick building with a corrugated metal addition we'd bolted onto the back in 2003 when the second line finally needed its own bay. If you drove past it on an ordinary Tuesday, you would never guess what it made or why it mattered to anyone. But if you walked in through the loading dock, past the roll-up doors that stuck in humid weather and needed a particular hip check to open all the way, you would hear the specific rhythm of stamping presses that I could pick out blindfolded. A heavy metallic thud every 2.5 seconds, followed by the softer hiss of the pneumatic ejector, followed by the rattle of parts sliding down a chute into a bin. That sound was the sound of my entire adult life. I could tell, walking through that door at 6 in the morning with my coffee still steaming in the cold air, where the press for was running a half-second slow, just from the rhythm alone, the way a father can tell his child has a fever just from the sound of their breathing in the next room. There's a wound underneath all of this that I have to tell you about, because it explains why what happened with Bradley Cole cut as deep as it did, deeper maybe than it should have for a man my age, who should know better than to expect gratitude from people who never had to earn anything themselves. My father left when I was 9 years old. Not died, left. Packed a duffel bag on a Sunday morning while my mother was at church and was gone by the time she got home. And the only thing he left behind, the only thing, was an unfinished workbench in the garage with one leg shorter than the other 3. I finished that workbench myself when I was 13, cutting the other 3 legs down to match instead of fixing the short one, because I did not have the tools or the money to do it the right way. Only the determination to do it some way. That crooked, patient, stubborn workbench taught me more about how to be a man than my father ever did in 9 years of being in the house. It taught me that when something is broken and nobody is coming to fix it for you, you fix what you can reach and you live with the compromise, and you keep going. So when Walter Cole looked at a 19-year-old, I was actually 19, not the 26 I told you earlier. I misremember it sometimes because it feels like it should have been later, like a boy that young shouldn't have been trusted with anything. When Walter Cole looked at me and said, "These hands have worked before." It was the first time since my father left that a man had looked at me and seen something worth building on instead of something to walk away from. I gave that company everything I had because Walter Cole gave me the first thing that felt like being chosen. And there's one more thing you need to understand before the villain of this story walks fully into frame, and it is this. My wife Linda used to leave a thermos of coffee on the dashboard of my truck before I woke up for the 6 a.m. shift. Back in the years when we couldn't afford a second alarm clock, and she got up anyway just to do it. Not a note. Never a note. Just the thermos, still warm, sitting on the dash like a small daily proof that somebody in the world had been thinking about me before the sun was even up. She did that for 11 years, until the plant moved me to first shift permanently in 2004, and some mornings even now, decades later, I still reach for the dashboard out of habit before I remember there's nothing there anymore except the memory of a woman who loved me quietly and completely before either of us had the money or the language to say so out loud. That is the kind of love the company was threatening, in its own strange corporate way, on the morning all of this began. Not a marriage, but a version of the same thing. A life built out of small, repeated, unglamorous proof that the work mattered and that I mattered because of it. Walter Cole retired in 2019 at 74 after a mild stroke scared his cardiologist more than it scared him. He handed the company to his only son, Bradley, then 36 years old, a man who had spent exactly 4 summers on the factory floor as a teenager doing the absolute minimum required of an owner's son, and the rest of his adult life getting an MBA from a program that taught him to talk about operational efficiencies and legacy cost structures in the same breath he used to talk about golf handicaps. I want to be fair to Bradley Cole here, because a man who is only a monster in your telling of a story is not a believable man, and I did, for a long time, believe there was something decent buried under all that polish. When Bradley first took over, He came down to the floor more than I expected. He knew my name. He shook my hand the first week with what seemed like genuine respect, and he said, "My dad always told me, if the plant's ever in trouble, go find Whitfield first." For about 18 months, that seemed true. He deferred to me on the floor. He asked good questions in meetings. There was a version of Bradley Cole in those early years that I could imagine growing into a man his father would have been proud of. Bradley dressed the part from his very first week. Tailored charcoal suits that had no business being worn on a factory floor that smelled of cutting oil and hot steel. A watch that cost more than most of our employees made in 2 months. And a handshake that he had clearly practiced somewhere, firm to the point of slightly too firm. The kind of handshake that is less a greeting than a small, quiet assertion of who is in charge of the room. He was polished. He was well-spoken. In meetings with our bank and with our biggest customers, he could talk for 20 minutes about market positioning and never once say anything you could disagree with, because he had learned, somewhere in that MBA program, how to fill a room with confident language that says almost nothing at all. For a long while, I mistook that polish for competence, the way most of us do, because it is easier to believe a well-dressed man knows what he's doing than to sit with the discomfort of wondering if he doesn't. But there was a first signal early on that I noticed and dismissed the way you dismiss a hairline crack in a foundation because the house is still standing and you have 100 other things to worry about that day. Bradley had a habit in every meeting of glancing at his phone the moment anyone on the floor started talking about production numbers, but locking eyes and nodding along attentively the second the conversation turned to numbers involving the company's valuation, or strategic positioning, or anything that touched what the company might be worth to someone else instead of what it made for the people who bought our fasteners. I noticed it. I told myself it meant nothing. Owners think about value. That's their job. I was wrong about what it meant, but I want to be honest and tell you I noticed it a full 3 years before it mattered, and I did nothing, because doing something would have meant accusing a man of a thought I couldn't prove he was having. The explicit insult, the one that finally made the crack in the foundation impossible to ignore, came at the company's 30th anniversary dinner, 8 months before he fired me. Walter Cole was there, in a wheelchair by then but sharp as ever, and during the toasts Bradley stood up in front of 40 employees and their spouses and said, raising his glass toward me with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "And of course, we can't forget Daniel, the last man standing from the original crew. Living proof we still know how to keep the lights on the old-fashioned way." The room laughed. It was meant as a joke, but I have run stamping presses long enough to know the difference between steel that has been tempered and steel that is simply old and tired, and that toast told the whole room, in the gentlest possible language, that Bradley Cole thought of me as an antique, a fixture, a cost of doing business that he tolerated out of some vague sentimental debt to his father, rather than a man whose actual expertise had kept that plant running through 2 recessions, a supplier bankruptcy, and one flood that would have shut most operations down for a month and shut ours down for 4 days, because I personally rewired half the control panels myself, standing in 8 inches of water, at 2 in the morning, in March. I did not react. I raised my own glass. I smiled. Linda squeezed my hand under the table hard enough to leave a mark, because she saw what the rest of the room didn't, and later that night in the car she said, "That man just called you furniture in front of everybody, and you smiled like he complimented you." I told her I was fine. I was not entirely fine, but I told myself the account was still in balance. 30 years of good work on one side, 1 bad toast on the other, and I let it go. The way you let go of most insults, because life is short and grudges are heavy, and I had a plan to run. There was a second signal that same night, one I only understood the full weight of much later. Toward the end of the dinner, I passed close by the small table where Bradley had set up a laptop for the anniversary slideshow, and I noticed his phone sitting face down on the tablecloth beside it, buzzing steadily, insistently, the way a phone buzzes when someone on the other end is impatient for a reply. He glanced at it twice during his own father's toast to the company Walter had built, picked it up once, thumbed out a short reply without excusing himself from the table, and set it face down again before Walter had even finished speaking. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was simply rude, a young man too plugged into his phone to give his own father's moment its due weight. I did not yet know that the messages waiting for him that night were coming from a man named Peter Farrow, 3 states away in a glass office in Chicago, checking in on the exact timeline of a sale that made the anniversary toast, the mention of legacy, the whole warm evening, into a kind of performance staged over a decision that had already quietly been made. I did not know, standing there smiling with a warm glass of cheap champagne in my hand, that Bradley Cole had already, 6 weeks earlier, signed a letter of intent with a private equity firm out of Chicago called Farrow Capital Partners, and that the entire 30th anniversary dinner, the toast, the smiling, the mention of Walter Cole's legacy, was theater staged for a company he had already quietly agreed to sell. The discovery, when it came, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in September, at exactly 2:41 in the afternoon, because I remember glancing at the clock on the break room wall out of the ordinary habit of a man whose whole working life has been organized around a time clock. I was in Bradley's outer office, waiting to hand him the quarterly maintenance report, and his assistant had stepped away, and his office printer, an old laser printer that had been jamming for 2 weeks, and that maintenance, meaning me, because I still fixed things nobody else wanted to touch, was supposed to look at that very afternoon, had jammed again, mid-print, spitting out half a page face up on the tray. I was not snooping. I want to be clear about that, because there's a difference between a man who goes looking for a wound and a man who finds one lying in the open because he was doing his job. I picked up the jammed page to clear the printer the way I had cleared it a dozen times before, and the paper in my hand was warm from the printer's heating element, and it smelled the way office paper always smells fresh off a laser printer, faintly of hot toner and static, and the words on that page, in 12-point font, under a letterhead that said Farrow Capital Partners, Confidential Due Diligence Memorandum, rearranged something in my chest before I had even finished reading the first paragraph. My hands went cold. In September, in a warm office with the afternoon sun coming through the blinds, my hands went cold the way they used to go cold on winter mornings, scraping ice off the truck windshield before dawn. Everything else got slow, the way it does sometimes right before something bad happens, like the volume on the whole world had been turned down to almost nothing, and all I could hear was the printer's fan still running and my own pulse in my ears. The memo laid out in the flattened, bloodless language private equity firms use to describe human beings, a cost rationalization plan, to be executed prior to closing, designed to improve the company's EBITDA multiple ahead of the sale. And there, under a subheading called Legacy Personnel Exposure, was a single line with my name on it. D. Whitfield, Plant Operations, 34 years tenure, top-of-scale compensation, significant unfunded pension liability exposure. Recommend termination pre-close to eliminate liability and normalize labor cost baseline. B. Cole has confirmed alignment on timing. B. Cole has confirmed alignment on timing. I read that sentence twice, and then I read it a third time. Standing there in an office with a broken printer and a cup of coffee I had already forgotten I was holding, because something in my chest was settling into place the way heavy furniture settles into a room you never asked to have furnished. A room I did not want, filled with a truth I had not gone looking for, but could not now unsee. There was more on the second page I found still sitting in the printer tray behind it, a page Bradley clearly had not meant for anyone to see. An internal email thread between him and a man named Peter Farrow, the firm's managing partner, forwarded and re-forwarded with comments stacked on top of comments the way those email chains get when men think they are only talking to each other. Near the bottom, in a message timestamped 3 weeks earlier, Bradley had written, Whitfield's the sentimental one my dad still asks about. He'll take it hard, but he's replaceable. Good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side. Never has. Cut him clean before close, so we're not carrying the emotional weight into the new ownership structure. Good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side. Replaceable. I want you to sit with that phrase the way I had to sit with it alone, in a hallway outside a printer, because it is the kind of phrase that does something specific and lasting to a man. It takes 34 years of 60-hour weeks, of 2 a.m. flood repairs, of a hand-built production line, of a life organized entirely around the success of somebody else's family business, and reduces the whole of it to 2 words, good hands, as if I were a tool in a drawer, as if the only part of me that had ever mattered to this family was the part below the wrist. I stood there long enough that the printer's fan wound down and the office went quiet except for the tick of the wall clock and the faint sound of the HVAC system cycling somewhere above the drop ceiling. I remember noticing, in that strange hyper-alert state grief puts you in before you've even admitted it's grief. The smell of the office, hot toner, the particular dusty smell of an air vent that needed its filter changed, and underneath it all, faintly, the leather of Bradley's new chair, ordered the month before from a catalog, because the old one, Walter's old one, had apparently not looked serious enough for meetings with Chicago investors. I noticed the framed photo on the credenza of Bradley shaking hands with Walter at his college graduation, both of them smiling, and I noticed that Bradley had never once, in 6 years of running that company, hung a single photograph of the plant floor itself, of the presses, of the people, the way his father's office walls had been covered with exactly that for 30 years. An office tells you what a man actually values if you're willing to read it the way you'd read a blueprint. And Bradley's office had been telling me for 6 years, in a language I hadn't wanted to translate. Replaceable. He'll take it hard, but he's replaceable. I read it again. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment. The kind of rage this genre of story usually promises you. But that is not honestly what I felt. What I felt was closer to grief. Grief for the young man I had been at 19, standing in front of Walter Cole believing he had finally been chosen by somebody. Not understanding yet that being chosen by a father is no guarantee you will be honored by a son. I put both pages back in the printer tray, exactly where I found them, smoothed them flat with the side of my hand, and I did not confront Bradley Cole that afternoon. I want to explain why, because a man watching the story unfold has every reason to wonder why I didn't march into that office and lay both pages on his desk and demand an explanation right then, while the anger was still hot enough to carry me through it. I didn't confront him because I understood, standing in that hallway with cold hands and a slow, quiet world around me, that a man who has already decided you are a liability to be eliminated before a sale closes is not a man who can be reasoned with in the moment his plan is discovered. He would simply move up the timeline. He would find a pretext, fire me for cause instead of convenience, and I would walk away with nothing. No severance, no leverage, no proof beyond 2 pages. I had already returned to a printer tray and could not exactly explain how I'd come to be holding. I needed time. I needed to know more than he knew I knew. And more than anything, some old, stubborn, 13-year-old part of me that once finished a crooked workbench, instead of walking away from it, decided, standing right there in that hallway, that I was not going to let this family's decision about my worth be the last word on the subject. 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in a doorway, with a cold cup of coffee in my hand, Bradley Cole said, "You're fired," without ever once meeting my eyes, and I understood, walking out to my truck with a cardboard box on my hip, that he had simply moved up the timeline the moment Faro Capital wanted the personnel issue cleared before the next round of diligence. I was not surprised. I had known it was coming for 6 weeks. What I had not told him, what he had absolutely no way of knowing, standing there scrolling his tablet while he ended 34 years of my life in 4 words, was that I had already spent those 6 weeks doing something about it. The night I found those 2 pages, I did not go straight home. I drove instead to a low brick building on the edge of downtown Dayton that I had visited exactly once before, 11 years earlier, when Walter Cole had a scare with the IRS and needed somebody sharper than his regular accountant. Marion Teller had been a forensic accountant for the Ohio Attorney General's office for 22 years before she retired and went into private consulting, and she was, without exaggeration, the smartest person I had ever sat across a table from in my life. I told her everything. The toast at the anniversary dinner, the printer, the 2 pages, the phrase "good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side." She listened the way good professionals listen, without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small and neat it looked almost typed. And when I finished, she set her pen down and said the sentence that reframed everything that followed, the sentence I have thought about nearly every day since. "Daniel, at your age, in a family business like this, it's rarely betrayal in the way people mean when they use that word. It's accounting. They're not doing this because they hate you. They're doing it because on a spreadsheet, gratitude doesn't amortize." She let that sit for a second, and then she added, more quietly, The question isn't whether they'll do it. They've already decided. The question is whether you're going to let them be the only people at the table who understand what the company is actually worth. Marion's office that night smelled of old paper and the particular dry warmth of a space heater running in a converted brick building in early autumn, and I remember the sound of her pen scratching against the legal pad, steady and unhurried, the sound of someone who has spent a career listening to people describe the worst financial moments of their lives and has long since learned not to let her own reaction show on her face until she's finished gathering every fact. "Tell me about the pension," she said at one point, and I explained that the plant still carried an old-style defined benefit pension for anyone hired before 2001, myself included, a plan that had quietly become, on paper, exactly the kind of liability a private equity buyer would want eliminated before a purchase, and exactly the kind of liability a man could only eliminate by getting rid of the people who were owed it. She nodded slowly, wrote something down, and said, almost to herself, "That explains the timing." Then she looked up at me directly and said the sentence about accounting, the one I have never once stopped thinking about since, and after a long pause she added something I didn't include earlier because I wanted you to sit with the first part on its own. "Daniel, you didn't survive 34 years in that building by being lucky. You survived it by being useful in ways that are very hard to replace quickly, no matter what that email says. The question now is whether you're willing to prove that on paper instead of just believing it in your chest." That single sentence, "Gratitude doesn't amortize," did something to me that no amount of anger could have done. It took the wound and turned it into a strategy. If Bradley Cole and a private equity firm out of Chicago saw me as a line item to be zeroed out before a sale, then I was going to become, before that sale ever closed, the single most informed line item in the entire transaction. For 6 weeks, before I was ever fired, I performed the ordinary rhythm of my life with a precision that, looking back, I am almost proud of. I made coffee every morning at 5:40. Same as always. I sat in production meetings across the table from Bradley Cole and nodded at his talk of strategic realignment with the same calm, useful face I had worn for 34 years. I went home every night and ate dinner with Linda and talked about the weather and our grandson's soccer schedule, carrying inside me the full weight of what I now knew, and letting none of it show on the surface. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in that, the exhaustion of performing normalcy over a foundation that is already cracked. And if you have ever lived through something similar, you already know exactly the tiredness I mean, the kind sleep doesn't fully touch. There was a Tuesday during those 6 weeks when Bradley stopped by my station on the floor, clapped me on the shoulder the way he did maybe twice a year, and said, "Couldn't run this place without you, Daniel. You know that." And I said, "Appreciate you saying so," in the same even tone I'd used for 3 decades, while somewhere behind my ribs a voice I didn't recognize as my own was asking how a man says a sentence like that with a straight face 6 weeks after writing that I was replaceable. In an email to a stranger in Chicago. I did not let it show. I have replayed that moment more than almost any other from those 6 weeks, because it taught me something about Bradley I hadn't fully understood before. He was not, I don't think, purely cruel. I believe some small, cowardly part of him actually meant it when he said he couldn't run the place without me, and that the other part of him, the part that had already signed a letter of intent, had simply decided that meaning it and acting on it were 2 separate questions with 2 separate answers, and that he could hold both without apparently feeling the contradiction between them at all. There was a Sunday evening during that stretch when Linda and I sat on the back porch after our grandson had gone home, and she asked me, gently, the way she always asks the questions she already half knows the answer to, whether something was wrong at the plant. I told her not yet, just that, not yet, and she nodded slowly and didn't push, because 39 years of marriage teaches you exactly when to press and when to simply sit beside a person in the quiet and let them carry what they're carrying at their own pace. She reached over and took my hand on the porch railing, and neither of us said anything else for a long while, and the crickets kept going the way they do out there regardless of what's happening in the lives of people listening to them. And I remember thinking that whatever happened at that plant, I still had this, a porch, a wife who knew when not to ask twice, 6 acres of quiet, and that thought alone was steadying enough to get me through the next morning. Evidence assembly during those weeks looked far less dramatic than the phrase suggests. It looked like Marion Teller and me sitting at her kitchen table 3 evenings a week with a laptop, a legal pad, and a pot of coffee that went cold more often than either of us drank it hot, cross-referencing county equity filings against the copies of Walter's original incorporation documents, which he still kept, yellowed and slightly brittle, in a fireproof box in his hall closet that he hadn't opened in over a decade. It looked like Grace Odom driving out from Cleveland twice to sit with all of us and explain, patiently, in language even a lifelong machinist could follow, exactly what a leveraged buyout structure required and exactly where Faro Capital's financing depended on assumptions Bradley had made about a clean cap table that were no longer true the moment his father decided to exercise his stake. It looked like 4 other employees, people I'd worked beside for decades, whose kids I'd watched grow up at company picnics, sitting in Marion's living room one Thursday night, quiet and a little afraid, deciding one at a time whether they trusted me enough to put their own savings into something that might not work. I want to tell you a little more about that Thursday night in Marion's living room, because it is one of the moments from that entire 6 weeks I think about most often. There were 5 of us gathered there besides Marion herself, myself, Carol from shipping, the 2 senior machinists, Ray Delgado and Sam Okafor, and a younger plant supervisor named Priya Anand, who had only been with the company 9 years, but had earned every bit of the trust the rest of us had in her. I laid out the whole thing plainly, the same way I'd laid it out for Walter. The memo, the email, the phrase, the numbers Marion had run, the risk, the very real possibility that we could put our own savings into this and still lose. Nobody said anything for a long moment after I finished. Sam turned his coffee mug in slow circles on Marion's kitchen table without drinking from it. Ray stared at a spot on the wall like he was doing long division in his head, which, knowing Ray, he probably was. It was Priya who spoke first. "I have a daughter starting college in 2 years," she said. "I've been putting money away for her for 9 years at this plant, doing math on a spreadsheet that assumed this place would still be here and still be decent to work for. If it's not going to be decent anymore, no matter what I do, I'd rather take the risk on making it decent again than keep quietly hoping somebody at the top remembers to be fair." Carol nodded along and said simply, "I've spent 26 years being told this place runs because of people like us. I'd like to find out if that's actually true." Ray finally looked up from the wall and said, "I don't like risk. Never have. But I like the alternative less." And that was as close to poetry as I ever heard out of Ray Delgado in 15 years of working beside him. By the end of the 6th week, we had a binder, an actual 3-ring binder, the kind you'd use for a school project, because Marion said plain and unglamorous was exactly the right presentation for a room full of people used to slick decks that hid more than they revealed, containing the equity filings, the valuation analysis for signed and notarized personal financing commitments, and copies, obtained entirely through lawful discovery, once Grace formally opened negotiations on our behalf, of the very documents that had started all of it. The memo, the email, the phrase that would not leave me alone no matter how many times I told myself to let it go. By the end of that 6th week, the viewer needs to understand, Bradley Cole had no possible way out of what was coming, and he did not yet know it. During those 6 weeks, Marion helped me do 3 things. First, we quietly and legally confirmed, through public county records and a title search that cost me $22, that Walter Cole still personally held a minority equity stake in the company, 11%, that he had never transferred to Bradley when he retired, a detail Bradley's own lawyers had apparently either overlooked or assumed was immaterial to a man in a wheelchair who no longer came to the office. 11% doesn't sound like much. In a leveraged buyout structure, where private equity firms are counting on a clean, fully consolidated cap table to secure their financing, an unaccounted for 11% minority holder with a personal grievance is not immaterial at all. It is, in fact, a landmine. Second, Marion helped me quietly value the company the way Faro Capital would be valuing it, not by its sentimental worth to a man like me, but by its actual cash flow, its equipment, its client contracts, several of which I personally still held the only working relationships for, because I was the man who had answered emergency calls from our biggest customer, a Cincinnati aerospace supplier, at every hour of the night, for a decade. Marion's analysis put the real, honest, hard-nosed value of Whitfield Cole Precision Fasteners, a name Walter had insisted on including mine on, back in 1998. In a gesture of gratitude Bradley had apparently forgotten entirely existed. At nearly 40% higher than the number Faro Capital was quietly offering Bradley, a number Bradley was eager to accept because he wanted out of the manufacturing business entirely and into whatever came next for a man who had never much liked the smell of hot metal in the first place. Third, and this is the part of the story I still have trouble believing myself when I say it out loud, Marion helped me find the money. I did not have millions of dollars sitting in an account. I had 34 years of a modest but disciplined savings habit, a paid-off house on 6 acres, a 401k I had never once raided even in the leanest years, and this is the part that still catches in my throat every time I tell it. I had Walter Cole himself, who, when I drove out to see him 3 weeks after finding those 2 pages in a printer tray and told him, gently, everything his son had written about me, sat quietly in his wheelchair by the window for almost a full minute before he spoke. He called you replaceable, Walter said finally, not as a question. He did. I drove out to see Walter on a Sunday afternoon in early October, the kind of cold, bright fall day where the light comes in low and gold through bare branches, and I found him on his back porch in a light jacket, a blanket over his knees that his home health aide had draped there and that he'd clearly forgotten about, watching a pair of cardinals work over the feeder his late wife Ruth had hung on a shepherd's hook near the fence line sometime in the early 90s. He smiled when he saw my truck pull in, the way he always smiled at me, and for a moment, sitting down across from him, I almost lost my nerve, because there's something particularly hard about being the one to tell an old man that his own son has written him a legacy he'd be ashamed of. I told him plainly, the way I would want to be told something like this myself, no softening, no dressing it up. I read him the line about legacy personnel exposure. I read him the line about good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side. I read him the word replaceable, and watched something in his face go still in a way I'd never seen in 3 decades of knowing him. Not even the day the bank nearly called their loan in 1994. Not even the day Ruth passed. Walter Cole looked out at his own backyard for a long moment, at the bird feeder, and when he turned back to me his eyes were wet in a way I had never once seen in 30 years of knowing him. Daniel, I built that company with a man who never once, in 30 years, called himself replaceable, and I let it fall into the hands of a boy who thinks a spreadsheet can tell him who deserves gratitude. I am so sorry. He was quiet for a moment, working his jaw the way he used to do on the floor when a batch came out wrong, and he was deciding how much of the loss to eat himself, rather than pass on to a customer. I gave him the company because he was my son. I should have given it to whoever actually understood what the company was for. Those aren't always the same person, and I knew that, and I let myself pretend otherwise because it was easier. I told him I wasn't asking for an apology. I told him I was asking for a partner. Walter Cole put his 11% equity stake, plus a personal loan against his own retirement accounts that his lawyer tried twice to talk him out of and that he signed anyway, into a private investment vehicle that Marion structured for me with an attorney named Grace Odom, a woman who had spent 15 years doing leverage buyouts for a Cleveland firm before deciding she'd rather help ordinary people win against extraordinary money than the other way around. Between Walter's stake and loan, my own life savings, a second mortgage on the Springboro house that Linda signed for without a single moment of hesitation, and a group of 4 other long-tenured employees, a plant supervisor, 2 senior machinists, and the woman who had run our shipping department for 26 years, who each quietly contributed what they could once they understood what was actually happening. We assembled, over the course of those 6 increasingly tense weeks, just enough capital and just enough leverage to make Faro Capital Partners an offer of our own, submitted not under my name, but under the name of a holding company Grace Odom set up called Samra Road Holdings, LLC, named after a dirt road outside a village in Pakistan that meant nothing to anyone in that boardroom but meant, to me privately, everything about starting again from almost nothing with your own 2 hands. Bradley Cole fired me on a Tuesday morning without ever knowing that his own printer had already told me everything I needed to know 6 weeks earlier, and without the faintest idea that the mysterious competing bidder his lawyers mentioned with irritation in a phone call 2 days later, a financially serious, well-capitalized private buyer represented by Odom and Associates, was, in fact, the man he had just walked out of a loading dock with a cardboard box on his hip. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in the very same conference room where he had fired me, 6 weeks after that Tuesday morning, on the day scheduled for the final signing of the sale to Faro Capital. Bradley had chosen that room deliberately, the way villains in this kind of story always do without realizing they're choosing the exact stage on which their own undoing will play out. His territory, his father's old company logo still on the wall behind him, his lawyers and Peter Faro's team seated along one side of the long table, coffee in real cups instead of the paper ones I used to drink from, because appearances mattered enormously to Bradley Cole on the day he expected to become a wealthy man. I walked in at exactly 10 o'clock, in a clean collared shirt instead of the work clothes he was used to seeing me in, with Grace Odom on one side of me and Marion Teller on the other, and Walter Cole, insisting on being there despite his health, in his wheelchair at the head of the table where he used to sit 30 years earlier running his own meetings. Bradley's face did something complicated when I walked in. Confusion first, then something that might have been the beginning of understanding, quickly buried under the reflexive confidence of a man who still believed, for another 90 seconds, that whatever was happening was a misunderstanding that money would fix. I did not raise my voice. I have not raised my voice at another human being in probably 20 years, and I was not going to start in the one room where it mattered most that I didn't. I set a single folder on the table, unopened, and I said, "Bradley, before your lawyers walk you through today's paperwork, there's something everyone at this table has a right to see first." "Daniel," he started, already reaching for the tone men like him use when they think a warehouse employee has wandered somewhere he doesn't belong. "I'm not sure what this is, but we're in the middle of a closing." "I know exactly what you're in the middle of," I said. "I've known for 6 weeks, since your printer jammed on a Thursday afternoon in September." I opened the folder and slid across the table, one piece of paper at a time, not all at once, the way you deal cards to a man who thinks he's already won the hand. The first page was a copy of the due diligence memorandum, the phrase legacy personnel exposure highlighted in yellow. The second was the email, "Good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side. He's replaceable," highlighted the same way. Peter Faro, seated 3 chairs down, went very still in the particular way men go still when they realize a deal they thought was clean has just developed teeth. "Those are out of context," Bradley said, his voice climbing half an octave, reaching for the first stage every cornered person reaches for. "That's normal deal language. That doesn't mean." "It means exactly what it says, Bradley," I said, still calm, still quiet. "And I'm not here about an apology. I'm here about a signature." I slid the third document across the table, the one Grace Odom had prepared, the one that laid out, in language even colder and more precise than anything Faro Capital had written about me, that Sommer Road Holdings, LLC, backed by Walter Cole's 11% equity stake and personal financing, and by 5 current and former employees whose combined tenure at that company totaled over 140 years, was prepared to close on the acquisition of Whitfield Cole Precision Fasteners, at a valuation 41% higher than Faro Capital's current offer, effective immediately, contingent on nothing except Bradley's signature. Peter Faro leaned over and read the offer twice, and I watched a man who trades in emotionless numbers for a living do the one thing every villain in this story eventually does to themselves without any help from me at all. He turned to Bradley and said flatly, "Bradley, if this number's real, we're out. We're not paying a premium to win a bidding war over a company we were buying at a discount specifically because you told us the personnel risk was contained." Bradley reached, in that moment, for the second stage, the pivot, offering to renegotiate terms with Faro on the spot, suggesting they could still make it work, his voice rising into something close to pleading with the very people who, 40 seconds earlier, he had believed were firmly on his side. And then he made the mistake that finished what I never had to finish myself. He turned to me, red-faced, and said the words that ended, permanently, any doubt anyone in that room had about what kind of man he actually was underneath the polish. You don't understand the business side, Daniel. You never did. This isn't your world. For a moment, nobody in that room moved. Even the young associate from Faro Capital, who had been quietly typing notes on a laptop, stopped typing. Bradley's face had gone the particular shade of red that comes not from anger, but from the sudden, physical understanding that you have said, out loud, in front of witnesses, the exact thing you should have kept buried, and that everyone at the table heard it, and that there is no way to unsay it now. That's not. Bradley started, and then stopped, because there was nowhere left for that sentence to go. Peter Faro closed his own folder with a small, final click that seemed unreasonably loud in that quiet room, and said, without much feeling one way or another, the way a man says something he has said 100 times before in 100 other rooms, Bradley, I've sat across the table from a lot of sellers. Most of them, when their own operations lead gets called replaceable, at least have the sense not to say it out loud in the meeting. We're done here. He stood, and his associate began packing a laptop, and for a moment it looked as though the entire private equity contingent might simply walk out and leave the two of us, buyer and seller, alone in the wreckage of what used to be a closing. Walter Cole, silent until that exact moment, spoke from his wheelchair at the head of the table in a voice that had not lost 1 ounce of its old authority. Bradley, he said, I built this company with this man's hand before you were born, and I am watching you lose it to him with your mouth. He turned to Grace Odom. Draw up the papers. Every share I have goes to the sale. Bradley's own attorney, a careful, quiet man named Sorensen, who had clearly seen enough leverage deals collapse to recognize the smell of one dying, closed his folder and said the one sentence that formalized, for the whole room, exactly what had just happened. Bradley, given the equity structure and Mr. Cole Sr.'s position, I'd advise you that Summer Road Holdings currently has the votes to force this transaction regardless of your personal preference. I'd recommend you review the offer rather than continue speaking. I want to tell you that the room erupted, that there was some cinematic triumphant silence, but the truth is quieter and more honest than that. Bradley Cole sat down. He put both hands flat on the table the way a man does when he needs something solid under his palms to keep from shaking, and he read through 11 pages of a deal that would strip him of a company his father built and handed, in exchange for a fair and generous buyout of his own remaining shares, to the man whose hands he had just, 30 seconds earlier, told the entire room did not understand the business. He signed it 40 minutes later. Nobody cheered. Grace Odom slid the signed pages into a folder without ceremony, the way you'd file away any other piece of paperwork, and Peter Faro's team quietly gathered their things and left first, murmuring something to Bradley on their way out that I didn't catch and didn't need to. Bradley sat at that table for a long moment after everyone else had started moving, staring at his own copy of the signature page as though it might read differently if he looked at it long enough. Walter wheeled himself over to his son's side of the table, and I stepped out into the hallway to give them whatever that moment needed to be, private and unwitnessed by a man whose hands his son had just insulted twice in the same conversation. I don't know exactly what passed between Walter and Bradley in those few minutes. I know that when Bradley finally came out into the hallway, his eyes were red in a way that had nothing to do with anger, and he stopped in front of me, and for one strange, suspended second, I thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he said, quietly, without the polish, without the tailored confidence, I didn't think you'd ever find out. Not I'm sorry, not I was wrong, just an acknowledgement, small and honest in a way nothing else he'd said to me in 6 years had been, that the whole plan had depended entirely on my never knowing what he thought of me until it was already too late to matter. I said, I know you didn't, and I let that be the end of it, because there was nothing left in me that wanted to spend one more minute of my life extracting an apology out of a man who had already told me everything I needed to know about how he saw me. I drove myself home that afternoon alone, the same 35 minutes down the same familiar roads I had driven for decades, and I did not feel triumphant the way I might have expected to feel walking into that meeting 6 weeks earlier. I pulled into my own driveway, put the truck in park, and sat there for almost 10 full minutes without moving, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to nothing at all, which is its own kind of loud after a morning like that one. What I felt, sitting in that driveway, was not victory. It was something far more complicated. A kind of grief, honestly, for the Bradley Cole who used to ask good questions in meetings during his first 18 months as owner, for the version of him I had genuinely hoped might grow into a man his father could be proud of. I felt exhausted, the specific exhaustion of 6 weeks spent smiling at a man across a conference table while carrying a wound he didn't know I was carrying. And underneath all of it, quietly, I felt something that surprised me most of all. I felt sad that it had come to this at all. Sad that a family who once looked at a 19-year-old's hands and saw something worth building on had ended up, 2 generations later, seeing the same hands as a liability to eliminate before closing. Bradley Cole's fate, in the months that followed, was not something I gloated over, and it isn't something I'll gloat over now. Telling you this story, his buyout payment, generous as it was mostly consumed within a year by legal fees from a separate and unrelated business venture that failed spectacularly. A cryptocurrency-adjacent consulting firm. He'd started believing his MBA and his last name would carry him the way they always had before. The house in Oakwood, the big one with the pool his father never once swam in, sold at a loss 11 months after the closing. Last I heard, from a mutual acquaintance who still does business with the plant, Bradley Cole was working an entry-level project coordinator role at a logistics startup downtown, the kind of job title a 24-year-old usually holds, and by all accounts, doing it without complaint. Sometimes the bottom really is the only honest place left for a man to start building something real, and I hope, sincerely, that he finds his way to building it. 1 year later, the plant looks almost exactly the way it always looked from the outside. Same brick, same loading dock, same faded sign that now reads simply Whitfield Precision Fasteners because the employees who own it alongside me voted, almost unanimously, to keep only the name that had actually been on the floor every single day for 3.5 decades. Inside, though, everything is different in the ways that matter most. Marion Teller sits on our small board now, unpaid, because she says watching this company succeed is worth more to her than any consulting fee ever was. Walter Cole still comes by every few weeks in his wheelchair, and the young apprentices on the floor treat him like the founder he is instead of a retired stranger, and I make sure of that personally. Linda and I still live in the same house on the same 6 acres, though the second mortgage is paid off now, faster than the bank ever expected, and some Saturday mornings I catch her standing at the kitchen counter with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, the way she used to leave one warm on the dashboard of my truck 40 years ago. Except now she just hands it to me directly, because we don't have to hide our care for each other behind small silent gestures anymore. We can afford, in every sense of that word now, to simply say it out loud. Our grandson rides in the shopping cart at the Home Depot on Route 4 most Saturdays, pointing at the industrial fan displays like they're the most miraculous machines he's ever seen. The same reaction every single aisle, and it still makes me laugh every single time. Because there is something in a 4-year-old's wonder at a spinning fan blade that reminds an old machinist exactly why the work was always worth doing in the first place. The plant itself runs differently now, in ways that took most of that first year to settle into. We instituted, at Marion's quiet insistence, an actual employee ownership plan, formalized this time, on paper, reviewed by lawyers, instead of the informal handshake goodwill that Walter had always relied on and that had turned out, in the end, to be worth exactly nothing once it collided with a spreadsheet. Carol from shipping sits on the board now alongside Marion. The 2 senior machinists who put their own savings on the line have a formal profit-sharing stake that neither of them had ever imagined having in their working lives, and I've watched both of them walk the floor with a straighter back since the day that stake became real, the particular posture of a man who finally understands that the building around him is actually is. Walter Cole passed away 8 months after the closing, peacefully, in his sleep, in the house with the bird feeder his late wife had put up decades earlier. I was one of the 6 pallbearers, and I stood at that funeral thinking about a 19-year-old boy whose hands a stranger had once looked at and decided were worth building something on. And I thought about how strange and enormous a debt like that turns out to be over the span of an entire life, and how grateful I am, still, that I got the chance to pay some small part of it back to him before he was gone. His obituary, at his own request, listed his occupation simply as machinist and founder. No mention of titles, no mention of the son who briefly sold the company out from under the men who built it. I think that was Walter's own quiet, final word on the matter, and I have never once needed him to say more than that. I still drive the same Ford the first drove the morning I got fired. I still wear the same kind of collared work shirts. I don't drive anything flashier now that I technically could, because the truck never once asked me what I was worth on a spreadsheet. It just took me wherever I needed to go, every single morning for 30 years, and some kinds of loyalty deserve to be honored rather than upgraded away. If there's one truth this whole story was ultimately about, it's this, and I want you to actually sit with it rather than just nod along the way we all nod along at things that sound wise, but slide right off us 30 seconds later. Gratitude does not amortize. You cannot put a person's years of loyalty on a spreadsheet and expect the spreadsheet to remember what the years actually cost that person to give. The moment somebody starts talking about you the way Bradley Cole talked about me, as an exposure to be managed, a liability to be cleaned up before the real business happens, that is the moment you are allowed, finally, to stop performing gratitude toward people who have already stopped extending it to you. There's a second truth underneath the first one, and it took me most of a year to be honest enough with myself to say it out loud. The people who try hardest to reduce you to a single dismissive phrase are very often the ones most afraid of what you actually represent. Bradley Cole did not call me replaceable because he genuinely believed 34 years of institutional knowledge and hand-built infrastructure could be replicated by hiring some other machinist off the street. He called me replaceable because some part of him understood, uncomfortably, that everything he had ever inherited rather than earned was standing right next to a man who had earned every single thing he had, and that comparison was more than he knew how to sit with honestly. Cruelty, I have come to believe, is very often just fear wearing a more comfortable outfit. I want to speak directly now to a few different people who might be watching this, because I know this story lands differently depending on where you are standing in your own life right now. If you are watching this and you are somewhere in the middle of discovering that the people you have given decades to see you as replaceable, I am not going to tell you that revenge is the answer, because it isn't. Not the hot kind anyway. But I will tell you that patience, real patience, the kind that keeps working while it quietly gathers proof, is the most underrated weapon a decent person has ever been given. Anger burns hot and fast, and usually burns the angry person worst of all. Patience is slower, quieter, far less satisfying in the moment, and it is also, in my own experience now, the only thing that actually changed anything for me and the 4 other people who trusted me enough to stand beside me when it mattered. If you are an adult child right now watching a parent get quietly pushed out of something they built by people who never once had to build anything themselves, please do not let your parents' dignity convince you that everything is fine. Dignity and being fine are not the same thing. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is ask, gently, what's really going on underneath the calm? Your parent may tell you not yet. The way I told Linda, not yet on our own back porch. Let them have that. But keep asking, gently, on your own timeline, because not yet is not the same thing as never. And a parent carrying something heavy alone for 6 weeks is still, quietly, hoping somebody notices enough to keep asking. If you are the person in your family or your workplace who has carried the weight for everyone else quietly for years, unseen, unthanked, doing the 2 a.m. flood repairs nobody else wanted to do, you already know, somewhere in your body, whether the people around you see your work as a gift or as an entitlement they're owed. Trust what your body already knows. Bodies remember things minds try to talk themselves out of. Mine told me something was wrong the moment I saw Bradley's phone buzzing face down on that anniversary tablecloth, 3 years before I ever found the proof, and I ignored it because it was inconvenient to believe. Don't make my same mistake. If your body has been telling you something for a while now, it already knows more than you're giving it credit for. If you are someone still inside the hardest part of a story like this one right now, still smiling in meetings, still making the coffee at 5:40, still performing the calm you don't actually feel because the paperwork isn't ready yet and the timing isn't right yet, I want you to know that the performing is not weakness. It is strategy, and it is one of the hardest, most disciplined things a person can do, and it will not last forever even though some days it feels like it will. And if you have ever loved a person, a company, a family, a piece of work, correctly and completely, and still watched it end in something that felt like betrayal, I want you to hear this clearly, because it is the single most important sentence in this entire story. You loved correctly. They acted incorrectly. Those are two completely different things, and only one of them is a reflection of your worth. Here is one small, practical thing I would ask you to do this week. If any part of this story touched something real in your own life, if you have given years of loyal work to any company, any family business, any organization, quietly pull whatever documentation exists of your actual contribution, not your job title, your actual contribution, the systems you built, the relationships you personally hold together, the emergency calls only you know how to answer, the knowledge that lives only in your own head and nowhere written down. Write it down in plain language, even if nobody ever asks to see it. List the clients who trust you specifically, the processes that would break without you, the years you've put in that nobody currently keeps score of but you. Knowing your own value in specific, concrete terms is not vanity. It is armor, and it is the first thing that stood between me and disappearing quietly the way Bradley Cole assumed I would. A man who knows exactly what he's worth is very hard to convince otherwise, even by someone with a tailored suit and a spreadsheet full of numbers designed to make him feel small. I think often about that crooked workbench my father left unfinished when I was 9 years old, the one I finished myself with 3 short legs instead of 4 even legs because I didn't have the tools to do it the proper way, and I refused to just leave it broken in the corner of a garage forever. I still have it, actually. It's in my own garage now, on 6 acres in Springboro, still slightly crooked, still holding up fine after 52 years, because sometimes the things we build out of necessity, with whatever we have on hand instead of what we wish we had, turn out to be sturdier than the things handed to us finished and perfect by somebody else. Bradley Cole inherited a company finished and perfect, handed to him by a father who built it from nothing, and it took him 6 years to run it into a position where he needed to eliminate the very people who kept it standing. I built a crooked workbench out of grief and stubbornness at 13 years old, and it has outlasted every single fancy piece of furniture I have ever seen in any office in my life. I don't think that's an accident. I think there's something true in it about what actually lasts. And I'll leave you with the question I still ask myself some mornings, standing in my own driveway with a cup of coffee that nobody has to hide on a dashboard anymore. Is there a room in your life right now where you are making yourself smaller, quieter, more replaceable, to keep somebody else comfortable? And if there is, how long exactly? Do you plan on staying in that room before you finally calmly decide to build a door out of it yourself? Drop a 1 in the comments if you believe Daniel made the right call by staying patient instead of confronting Bradley the moment he found those 2 pages in the printer. Drop a 2 if part of you still feels for Bradley Cole, even after everything, and thinks there was a version of this story where he could have chosen differently and didn't have to lose it all. Drop a 3 if some part of the story, the workbench, the thermos on the dashboard, the 2 a.m. flood, the phrase good hands, but he doesn't understand the business side, touch something real from your own life that you've never quite said out loud to anyone. Whichever number you drop, I read every single one, and I mean that literally rather than as a line I say for the algorithm. Some of you have written me comments longer than this entire script, and every one of them has made this channel a little more like the kitchen table it's meant to be instead of just another video passing through your feed. Tell me where you're watching this from, and what time it is there right now. Someone always watches these videos at 2 in the morning from somewhere I never would have expected, carrying something heavy that this particular story happened to meet at exactly the right moment. And every single time I read that comment, it means something to me. This channel isn't really about entertainment. It's a place for people who have carried more than their share quietly for longer than anyone around them ever noticed. And if that's you, I'm genuinely glad you're here. This is a fictional story, inspired by real emotional experiences and fully reimagined here in Dayton, Ohio, to create original content for this channel. Any resemblance to real people, companies, or events is entirely coincidental. If anything in this story matched your own life a little too closely, please consider reaching out to a licensed attorney, a labor rights organization, or a counselor you trust. You deserve real support, not just a story that understands you. And remember, sometimes the truth doesn't arrive with a crash. Sometimes it's just a warm sheet of paper in a printer tray on an ordinary Thursday afternoon that you finally stop ignoring. Pay attention. Stay kind. Stay awake.